Welcome to the Workplace Wellbeing Essential Series. I'm Mari Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Advancing Wellness. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this expert interview where we explore topics that impact employee well-being. My guest today is Stefanie Heiter. Stefanie is the founder and partner at Bridging Distance and has helped pioneer the field of disbursed teaming and leadership since 1997. Stefanie is among the nation's leading thinkers and consultants on the human side of virtual work. She has authored numerous published articles in the area of virtual leadership, teams, and communications, and created 6 training workshops. And you can bet she's been busy in the past year as the world has moved to virtual work. When not consulting and conducting research, Stefanie looks after her own well-being by hiking, canoeing, and biking. Stefanie, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Mari.
Well, thank you. Well, as we know, in the last year, the world of work has changed significantly. And as a result of the pandemic, we've gone from a traditional work environment and showing up in office places to a distributed model. And now employers are really at that place where they're having to plan for the future of their workplaces. And as a result, this is really causing a lot of anxiety, I think, amongst employers as to how they're really going to make the most of bringing their workforce back, if indeed they even do. So today we're going to explore this impact of remote work and how it impacts the well-being of the workforce. One thing we know for sure, and Stefanie and your team are going to be really busy as a result of this, we know that remote work is here to stay. Employers are taking many different approaches in their planning steps when they look at where their workforce will actually work. So some might be completely remote, some might be in the office, and what we're, creating what we're now calling, I guess, this hybrid model. And a few are actually bringing all of their employees back, whether they want to or not, which is one of the things we should talk about. So what should employers be thinking about as they're creating this virtual work enablement strategy?
So the first thing that we're seeing to consider is that there are a number of companies. So Boston.com just did a survey of close to 2,000 people just in the Boston area recently, and they found that 60% of employers still haven't communicated anything about what their return to office strategy is. And what's amazing is that I think that prolonged uncertainty is causing a lot of stress for people, the unknown. And so we fully understand that this is new territory for lots of people, but the lack of communication is really profound and has an impact on what people want to do and is a potential talent drain. So what we recommend is, first of all, in that case, to at least recognize what are the criteria we're going to use to make that decision. So is it things like location, seniority, job function, what are the, where we are, all of the different aspects in terms of what are the criteria that companies are going to use to make those decisions, and is it voluntary or mandated, so that people at least have some awareness in that. And then in doing that, if you can, use some real-time surveying. There are lots of tools out there to do a quick survey, just a quick pulse, particularly for your high-performing talent, the key talent that you want and need to retain. You need to find out how they're doing, how they're feeling, and what they're thinking. And then we're also seeing that sometimes this has just become an HR initiative, when in fact, we recommend that it be a cross-functional initiative so that you hear from the various factions, because HR has one perspective, and at least if it's only HR, then you'll also want to make sure that you're bringing in that real-time data and the feedback, and then at least running the plans by. So a couple of other considerations is to see if you can, in fact, have some kind of a cross-functional task force.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be lengthy, because one thing that we also know in uncertainty is that you want to build in flexibility to the plan,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what we're seeing is there are almost two camps, right? There are the people who are being thoughtful and strategic about their plan, thinking it through, trying to at least get some criteria out there and think about it and make sure that they understand it has to be flexible and iterative. And then there are others who are taking a wait and see approach.
Yeah.
And that wait and see, we're predicting, is going to kind of backfire, because people aren't going to want to stay in that. And then there's the kind of let's just go for it, and what we're calling the wing it approach, to just come in and do it. And I think the latter two cause, again, a tremendous amount of stress, because people are not certain, and that makes a really big difference in terms of what you can do. So again, making sure that you're taking into account what people want and how they're going to work, and being able to communicate that becomes really important. And then, I think in terms of wellness, what we've seen over the last year is this work-life fusion or integration, where things are blurred and people are set up that way. So being able to understand and set up the structures for people to be able to be valued and goaled and add value based on what they're performing and what they're doing, and some of those elements to it. So, and then the last piece, I think, or not the last piece, but a last piece, is this concept of fairness and equity, which people are really struggling with. So how do you make it fair? And I'm not a compensation expert, but there are some things around fairness, around compensation, as well as ways in which to make that work.
Well, I'd love to explore a little bit this idea that, as your first statistic, that so many employers haven't made publicly acknowledged what they're doing with their workforce. So no doubt that's causing stress and anxiety for people. But this whole hybrid model and managing a distributed workforce seems like it requires some different thinking, and that it's much more complex. I'm curious, from your perspective and with all the research and work you've done, what are the complexities that exist when trying to build this model of, a distributed workforce?
So the complexities are that if you're not careful, we go back to having haves and have-nots. So people who are remote might feel digital isolation, right? So we just finished some research on looking at the impact of digital isolation and loneliness on workplace productivity. And what we found is the overriding word that came up again and again was connect and connection, and ways in which people can do that. So you want to be able to do it both synchronously, so in real-time connection, but also asynchronously, and being able to use the technology tools for people to feel like they are engaged in having conversations. But the complexity is really the most critical aspect to being able to make hybrid work is to formalize the informal, to set up structures so that people are able to be successful regardless of where they are. And the challenge is that those people who are returning to an in-person situation full-time or even more than part-time don't necessarily understand or need or recognize that they need to have those formal structures in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about things like, how often are we going to meet? How are we going to find each other? Aspects of creating visibility, because we know that visibility and transparency create trust. Mm-hmm. And we know the absence of that actually depletes trust. So we're drawing down our trust checkbook balance just by doing nothing. And so we know that those informal interactions, what they call, sometimes you'll call them, conscious collisions is a term that's come up a lot. I know some companies, one company we worked for several years ago actually moved their bathrooms to a central location so people would have those opportunities to interact. So we have to formalize those informal collisions where people can do that. And there's a ton of tools out there. You can Google any of it. But really, the aspect of this is from a leadership perspective to make it happen, and from an organizational perspective to recognize the need. Otherwise, we go back to what we used to have pre-COVID, which is either a proximity bias, which is we are biased towards those who are located with us. And in COVID, we find that that has morphed into something called temporal bias, which is those who are closer to or at our own time zones. And those become really critical to be able to navigate that. And so what we sometimes do as teams and individuals is to be able to say, we need to create dense social networks for in-person and for remote people to be able to reach out to each other. So it has an impact on onboarding, for example. You know, how do you onboard somebody, and then, you know, be able to say, okay, Mari, you're this month I'm going to meet with you, and we're going to spend 20 minutes just having a chit chat, just getting to know each other, because that also breaks down some of the silos that we've seen built that have become really impenetrable in COVID, because we're just interacting with people on task.
I'd like to go back for a moment to this topic of what you describe as the have and have nots. How can employers who are embracing the remote work and giving their employees the flexibility in the places that they work, how do we avoid creating these two classes, if you will, of employees, you know, the office employees versus the remote employees? How do we avoid that?
The most basic thing that needs to be done is to be able to recognize that there is that bias towards those who are in person, and to be able to talk some about that. The other thing is, you know, one of the concerns that we often hear is, how do I, if my people aren't in the office with me, how do I recognize who my top talent are, who, you know, what, and how do I make sure I'm keeping them? And how do we make sure that we're mentoring them, that we're able to you know, move them along? And so being able to formalize processes, so to recognize how we are rewarding, what we're rewarding, and making sure that that's aligned with our company values. So if we're rewarding task completion, virtual and in-person interactions, so interactions in general, regardless of how they are, which means we need to take into account asynchronous or non-real-time interactions when we evaluate. And then the ability for people to then share with each other and knowledge. And so, again, when I was talking about formalizing structures, one of the things that we came across a lot in early COVID is that companies that have a culture of having information in people's heads as opposed to keeping minutes, and this is how things done. If you remember way back in the 80s, we had that knowledge drain where people were being replaced by folks that were cheaper and younger. But what they didn't realize is that they also let go of the people who knew how to run the company. So the more that you can formalize that and have, you know, a company playbook that's iterative and has links that you can share with people, because Mari, if you and I are in the same office and I can tap you on the shoulder and say, Mari, can you help me with this? It doesn't matter, because it's in your brain and I have access to it. Right. But if I'm in Germany or South America, I can't find you. And so that means that, first of all, I don't benefit from your knowledge. You don't get to share that, and we don't all grow together. So there's a couple ways in which that can be done. But I think the first is to make sure that there's parity across remote and in-person, so that people don't feel slighted. And if they do, talk about why. So earlier I talked about the criteria for our decision about how we're going to move forward and how do we manage this kind of messy middle. If we don't talk about why some people are coming back and why others aren't, then we create that disparity. One last piece. Many years ago, we used to, so I don't know if you remember this, but sometimes companies have like names or nicknames or letters for different locations. So DEC used to have that, a lot of the different ones. You can also create for people, so you know, you go to this location, you go to the Boston area, or you go to the Andover, or you're up in Belfast, Maine, or wherever it is, or it's a code. You can also create a remote worker code and create a cohesion and a cohort, a set of compatriots there who are all working remotely. And then sometimes if they're dispersed, you know, like 3 hours apart, they can meet every quarter for golf or pizza or something to be able to have those informal interactions.
That's great. Well, you know, with you talk about some of these processes and formalizing them and being really intentional about them, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the managerial viewpoint. So managers are probably going to have to start really changing their mindset about how they manage their employees, right? So there's no more management by walking around, or, that people, this was a big thing in my career. You could see these managers just walking around, and that was how they managed. And that mindset is going to need to change to, it's not just how somebody there from 9 to 5. I think the 9 to 5 workday is probably history. So how do we support managers to adapt to this new way of working?
So the best thing that you can do is what we do call it around creating presence for people, because presence overcomes all kinds of distance. So the aspects of creating presence is not just about walking around. It's kind of how do you walk around the globe or the country or just even New England. And the way to do that is both synchronously, but when you have multiple time zones. So if you have a team where people are in California and Europe, that's 9 time zones. It's hard to be awake that long. So what we want to do is think about asynchronous ways too. So having chats, being able to comment on documents, being able to make short videos that you send out to your team, even if it's, 90 seconds of, hey, just wanted to check in with you guys. I wanted to give you a quick update, right? And we have a virtual leader model that we actually just revalidated, and we're about to release the new pieces of it. And it has 3 scales to it: creating community, directing digitally, and engaging electronically. The creating community is the team piece of it. Directing digitally is how do you do managerial operational stuff in a digital format, and engaging electronically is the one-to-one. But the critical aspect, another way in which leaders can do that is we talk about, in creating community, we talk about managing the environment, or, doing that, and building the team. So virtual leaders need to also recognize and understand if people are remote from home or if they're in another location, they can create visibility and presence by getting resources or by understanding something about the location. And again, it used to be, and kind of still is, that if you see somebody posting a lot on LinkedIn and they're inside of a company, you think, oh, they're looking for a job. But now we're seeing more and more robust LinkedIn, because people are recognizing from a virtual leader perspective, creating those dense networks inside the company and out. So if I can create somebody, so if, Mara, if you're my manager and you're here in the Boston area, and I'm working from Mexico City, you might want to see what you know about Mexico City. Who do you know in the company? And just get to know that so that you can have some kind of camaraderie with me. So there's that ability to gain resources. And the other danger that we have to be aware of is the ways in which leaders are communicating. And is it equitable? Or they're not just having a hallway conversation with somebody. Like, are communications fair? And do people have access to the same information at the same time? And then those leaders have to be really good translators of information coming from the team out to the greater world about how great their team is and the good stuff that they're doing, really uniformly, but also being able to filter information from the broader organization to the team in terms of what they need, again, equitably and uniformly, not so that you overwhelm people, but so they are informed and know what to do.
Well, your virtual leadership model sounds fabulous, and I can't wait to learn more about that. And I noticed that, you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned there in your model, that there's a lot of elements around this idea of connection and community. And connection and community are 2 core elements, both of who we are as humans and how we function in a workplace, but they're also core to our well-being. And how will we really create a workforce that can have really strong connection and collaboration? And I'm also curious about what role culture plays in this. You did talk about, communication, obviously, but with a distributed workforce, how is this going to impact us on connection and community?
So I think some of it starts with a mindset that informal connection is valuable to the team and to the company. And it's an activity that has kind of flown below the radar in an in-person setting. And now we have to bring it up and elevate it a little bit to formalize that. So it means when you do, virtual team building or playing games together or being able to share. So again, that permission, like I just think about, for years, we've always started our meetings with kind of a check-in question, favorite color, vacation spot, Mari, you're going on vacation or you went on vacation, show us your photo, the best photo you took there, right? And those things breed connection. So something to consider. So being able to have those things be informal. The other aspect is that when you talk about connection, you're talking about trust building. And trust building in virtual settings, there's two types of trust that we talk about. I did my master's thesis in the 90s on trust in global teams, and we isolated two types of trust. The first is what we think about as trust building, and that's called relational trust. And that's trust based on how we get to know each other, how we learn about informals, coming back, and the things that we miss is to say, hey, I know that your kid was in a soccer tournament. How did she do? Or, what's happening with the car? Did you get a new car? Or, whatever it was. And we have those informal things. And that's how we get to know each other based on commonalities and experiences. And that's kind of the traditional team building where people shoot each other with paintballs or jump out of trees or whatever it is. But in a virtual setting, often it's called transactional trust. And that's trust that's built based on the way in which we execute on our tasks. And in virtual settings, with people who don't know each other that well, we start to build trust and expectations of people based on how they complete their tasks on time as expected. Do they respond to each other? Because we know that relationships diminish across distance and power, and technology can dehumanize those relationships. So if I don't have a criteria that says I'm going to respond to my team member who's 9 hours away first, because I know that she can't do the rest of this task if I shut down for the day. And so when we have formal criteria that we are looking at in terms of who gets communicated to and when, those connections can happen. So again, we want to formalize informal connections and give permission and structure it so that people can get to know each other. And that trust becomes really important around the visibility. Well, and I think it's going to become particularly important because I hear a lot that people are thinking, oh, the hard part's over. We got through COVID and we did this suddenly remote. But I speculate we're about to enter the hardest part and something we're calling the messy middle. And that's where we're all trying to figure it out. And some of us want to go back to the way it was, and some of us want to move forward, but we don't know in which direction. And so there's going to be a push and pull that leaders are going to have to surface and talk about.
Yeah. Well, all good suggestions there, and appreciate that. And I'm really curious from your perspective, when you think about the well-being of the workforce, and especially now that we're, for many, we're in this distributed model, there's sort of two schools of thought about this. There's the folks that say that, well-being has improved for those who are working from anywhere because now they're not commuting, they have more flexibility in their workday. And, they can take more time, perhaps replace that commuting time with time that they might focus on their own well-being. And then there's the school of thought that says well-being has diminished because people are tethered to the computers. We don't have those natural breaks, such as commuting time. And so now we're getting stressed, anxious, and burnt out because we're never disconnecting. So I'm curious, from your perspective as an expert in this field, what are your thoughts about, where we are in terms of well-being for the employees, and how can we make sure that we look after the well-being in this new model of work?
So first of all, I think it's not an either or. I think both of those can be true. I think that lots of people have become more productive at home because they don't have the commuting time and they're working more hours. But there's a particular level. There's a lot of talk about how women who have children at home are actually really struggling, and many have left the workforce because they can't manage it. So that's obviously not for the well-being of that woman who's had to put her career on hold. I think a couple of things. One is, first of all, to understand for each person's perspective, how much connection do you need to people? And that connection if that connection is important to you around being productive, how do you make those happen in terms of that? So understanding a little about your own style, extroversion, introversion, whatever it is, and the need for that. The other aspect in terms of productivity is we have a model on why hybrid is the most complex. And one of the things that we ask people to rate is how much interconnection do they need in order to be successful? How much collaboration do they need in order to be successful? And if you have a team that has a shared task and they need to interact a lot, then you need to make sure those structures are in place. From a wellness perspective, if those structures are not in place and these meetings aren't taking place, then the people are going to feel left out and get burned out more.
Yeah.
But there's also a recognition that not everything has to be a meeting. We have something we call meetingitis, which is, the first thing we do is we have a meeting without thinking about, can we put a discussion up for 48 hours and get everybody to weigh in? And I think that that's something people are going to have to learn. What's our criteria for when we have a meeting and what we do asynchronously?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is not everything has to be a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting. You can have a meeting walking around with your earbuds in and walking around. I have some clients in the South that have, I've been there in a year, obviously, but they have pathways around their buildings that say, if you have a 30-minute meeting, start here, and then you'll be back in 30 minutes. So if we can get to an overall aspect where the organization recognizes that people were productive working remotely because they had the ability to leave, and then giving permission for people to leave. One thing that we saw a lot is that companies were measuring people's productivity by how long they were logged into the VPN or how much activity they had on the computer, which research has, prior to COVID and even now again, has said that that's actually a terrible indication because it promotes a lack of wellness and a stealth where you're going to say, hey, to my kid, move my mouse every 5 minutes so it looks like I'm busy. And that's just, nobody wants to work in that kind of a setting. So the more that we can recognize and know what's good for our employees, again, surveying will help. What kind of well-being do they want? And how much connection do we really need? Mm-hmm. And being able to recognize all the ways in which we can communicate with each other. Sending fun things to each other, a quick little video or something, also breeds connection. And so therefore we don't have to do a drain. And a year ago, nobody wanted to use video, and now it's becoming mandatory. And so we have to recognize when is it okay to not use the computer, or is it okay to do it at the beginning and say hi to each other? As long as you're not multitasking, it's okay.
Yeah.
Does that get at what you're looking for?
Yeah, no, thank you for those insights with regard to how we can support employee well-being. That's really helpful. Is there anything you'd like to add, Stefanie, in terms of the work that you're currently doing or some of the research that you've completed? Other thoughts you'd like to add?
So you had asked about culture. And what was interesting is we just completed a research project on the impact on the ways in which culture, we started with national culture, but then we broadened into organizational culture, impacts technology adoption. So our choice of technology and use of technology. So we're just about to release that data. And so that's something that we can learn about, because people aren't going to jump on airplanes to solve issues of culture anymore.
Right.
So that's one thing. So stay tuned for that. But secondly, one thing that will enable people to be successful remotely or wherever is thinking about, what does your culture stand for? So if we have a culture that says we value people, right? So let's go back to your wellness question and the work that you're doing, Mari, right? So if we value people, and that's one of the things that we value, then we need to make sure that the ways in which we are valuing people happens at each of the locations, and if people are working from home. And that has to translate into, pay time off when you need to, or work a flexible schedule as long as you're meeting what you need to do and your requirements. So moving from a perception of how hard you're working to actual real-time data about what you're producing. And this idea of really taking people into account. And that's what we call the portability of culture. So the ways in which our culture is portable from one location to another can really ensure people's wellness and their ability to add value and to stay connected.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look forward to in terms of your research and so many complexities. So I can see why you are such a value to the clients that you work with, and why so many more organizations should be working with you and your team. Stefanie, if our audience wants to learn more about you and the work that you and your team are doing, where can they find you?
So our website it has a lot of stuff. The Bridging Distance website has a lot of information for people. We have a blog. You can sign up for our tips. We do free webinars every month. We also do a lot of posting on LinkedIn, some preliminary leaks of some of the things that we found in our research. And so look for that in terms of following the Bridging Distance LinkedIn page, or you can, friend me or connect with me, I guess is the LinkedIn term. Connect with me there. So
great. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your vast experience with us and with the audience today. As always, it's a delight to spend time with you, Stefanie.
Thanks, Mari. Same goes for me. Take care.